The Dusty Rose Saloon reeked of stale whiskey, tobacco smoke, and the sour sweat of desperate men. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows across weathered faces bent over cards, their yellow light barely penetrating the haze that hung thick as storm clouds. In the corner, a piano wheezed out a melancholy tune, its keys yellowed and chipped like old teeth. The floorboards groaned under heavy boots, and the constant clink of coins and glasses created a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. At the center table, where the air seemed thickest and the silence most profound, 5 men sat locked in the final hand of a poker game that had been running since sunset. Now, with midnight approaching, the stakes had grown beyond mere money. The pot held more than gold coins and crumpled bills. It held a human life. Clara Mayfield sat in a wooden chair beside the table, her wrists and ankles bound with iron shackles that had rubbed her skin raw. A coarse wool cloak covered most of her small frame, but it couldn't hide the purple bruises on her arms or the defiant tilt of her chin. At 19, she should have been dancing at church socials or helping her mother tend a garden. Instead, she was collateral in a debt her father could never repay, payment for gambling losses that had spiraled far beyond his control. Her green eyes moved between the players with a mixture of fear and calculation. She had learned to read men's faces during the 3 weeks since her father's creditors had claimed her. Some looked at her with hunger that made her stomach turn. Others saw her as nothing more than property, a prize to be won and used. But the stranger who had joined the game an hour ago was different. He barely glanced her way, and when he did, his expression was unreadable. Elias Carter sat with his back to the wall, a habit that had kept him alive through 10 years of drifting across the frontier. He was tall, even seated, with broad shoulders that strained against his worn cotton shirt. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and a week's worth of beard shadowed his angular face. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, and cold as mountain ice. A Colt .45 rested in the holster at his hip, the leather worn smooth from years of use. He had ridden into Deadwood Gulch that afternoon, his horse lathered with sweat and his saddlebags light. Word traveled fast in frontier towns, and he had heard about the high-stakes game before he'd even secured lodging. More importantly, he had heard about Silas Crowther. Crowther sat across from Elias, his corpulent frame spilling over his chair like melted wax. Gold teeth flashed when he smiled, which he did often, though his small black eyes never warmed. He owned the Dusty Rose, along with half the buildings in town, and his fingers reached into every questionable enterprise within 50 miles. Men like Crowther thrived on the frontier's lawlessness, growing fat on others' desperation. "Well, gentlemen," Crowther wheezed, his voice thick with cigar smoke and satisfaction, "seems we've reached the moment of truth." He gestured toward Clara with a jeweled hand. "The young lady here represents a debt of $500, a sum her dear departed father was unable to settle before his untimely passing." His smile widened. "I've been gracious enough to accept alternative payment arrangements." The other players, a nervous bank clerk named Peterson, a cattle buyer called Murphy, and a local rancher named Hayes, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had stayed in the game longer than wisdom dictated, drawn by the unusual stakes and the whiskey that kept flowing. Now, faced with the reality of what they were gambling for, their enthusiasm had curdled into something uglier. Clara's jaw tightened. Her father hadn't just died. He had been found hanging in his jail cell 3 days after Crowther's men had dragged him in for questioning about his debts. The sheriff called it suicide, but Clara knew better. William Mayfield had been many things: a dreamer, a gambler, a man who made promises he couldn't keep. But he had never been a quitter. 500, Elias said quietly, his fingers drumming once against the table's scarred surface. That's a considerable sum for a young woman in these parts. Crowther's smile faltered slightly. The stranger's tone carried an undercurrent that made the saloon keeper's instincts prickle. Indeed it is. Mr. Carter. Her father was quite the optimist when it came to his prospects. Thought he could strike it rich in the gold fields. But the only thing he struck was trouble. Funny thing about trouble, Elias replied, his pale eyes fixed on Crowther's flushed face. It has a way of finding its way back to the man who starts it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Murphy cleared his throat nervously and reached for his whiskey. Peterson wiped sweat from his forehead despite the evening chill. Hayes, who had known hard men in his time, recognized the look in Elias's eyes and began calculating how quickly he could fold and leave. "Are we playing cards or swapping philosophy?" Crowther snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I've got other business to attend to tonight." Elias smiled, a thin, predatory expression that never reached his eyes. "By all means, let's finish this." He pushed a stack of gold coins into the center of the table. "I call." The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled taut. Clara found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't say why. There was something about the stranger that set him apart from the others, a sense of controlled danger that reminded her of a wolf watching a flock of sheep. Crowther laid down his cards with a flourish. 3 queens, a sight that had been winning him hands all evening. "Read 'em and weep, gentlemen." Peterson and Murphy folded immediately, their relief palpable. Hayes hesitated, then laid down 2 pair with a disgusted grunt. That left only Elias, who studied his cards as if seeing them for the first time. "Well," Crowther demanded, his confidence returning, "let's see what all that frontier wisdom bought you." Elias set his cards down one by one. The 10, Jack, Queen, King, and Ace of Spades, a royal flush, the kind of hand that came along maybe once in a lifetime. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the piano player had stopped, drawn by the tension radiating from the corner table. Crowther's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that made his gold teeth seem garish. "That's," he began, then stopped, his eyes darting between the cards and Elias's impassive face. "That's a hell of a hand, stranger." "It is," Elias agreed. He began gathering the pot with methodical precision, the coins, the bills, and finally the key to Clara's shackles that Crowther had placed as surety. "I believe this concludes our business." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. In her mind, she had been hoping that one of the local men might win, someone she could reason with, perhaps even escape from. But this stranger was an unknown quantity, and unknown quantities in the frontier were rarely benevolent. Crowther's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt, but stopped when Elias's fingers found the grip of his own weapon. The metallic whisper of steel clearing leather filled the sudden silence. "I wouldn't," Elias said conversationally. "The lady and I will be leaving now. I trust there won't be any complications." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Crowther's hand slowly moved away from his gun, but his eyes promised future reckoning. "You won her fair and square," he said through gritted teeth. "But don't think this ends here, stranger. I know every trail out of this territory, and I've got friends who don't take kindly to outsiders disrupting local business arrangements." Elias stood, his full height imposing in the low-ceilinged room. "I'm counting on it." He pocketed the key and moved toward Clara, whose heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. As he approached, she could smell leather and gunpowder, trail dust, and something else. Something clean, like pine trees and mountain air. His pale eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw something unexpected in their depths. Not the hunger or calculation she had grown accustomed to, but something that might have been regret. "Ma'am," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Clara looked around the saloon one last time, at Crowther's murderous glare, at the other players' mixture of relief and curiosity, at the handful of patrons who had witnessed her fate being decided over a deck of cards. Then she looked back at the stranger who had won her. This Elias Carter, whose motives were as mysterious as his sudden appearance in Deadwood Gulch. She had no choice but to trust him. In a world where women like her had precious few options, sometimes trust was the only currency that mattered. "Yes," she whispered, taking his arm with hands that trembled only slightly. "Let's go." As they walked toward the saloon's batwing doors, the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo with the weight of destiny. Behind them, Crowther's angry muttering mixed with the nervous chatter of men who had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the cool night air that would soon greet them, the choices that lay ahead, and the question that burned in Clara's mind as surely as the oil lamps burned in the dusty Rose Saloon. What did this stranger intend to do with a woman he had won at cards? The answer, she would soon discover, was nothing like what anyone expected. The night air struck Clara's face like a cold slap, sharp and clean after the stifling atmosphere of the dusty Rose. Above them, a canopy of stars stretched across the endless frontier sky, with the moon hanging like a silver coin over the sleeping town. Main Street lay before them in dusty silence, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the whispered conversations drifting from behind closed doors. Elias's hand remained steady on her elbow as they stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, his boots making measured sounds against the weathered planks. Clara could feel the curious eyes of late-night stragglers following their progress, and she pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. Word would spread quickly through Deadwood Gulch. The stranger had won Crowther's girl in a poker game, and now he was taking his prize. But instead of leading her toward the hotel or one of the boarding houses where men usually took women they had acquired, Elias guided her toward a bench outside the general store. The simple wooden seat sat beneath a hand-painted sign advertising everything from flour to firearms, and moonlight pooled around it like spilled milk. "Sit," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the rough command she had grown accustomed to from men. It was more of a request than an order. Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming that this was wrong somehow. Men who won women in card games didn't ask them to sit on public benches. They didn't speak in quiet, respectful tones. They certainly didn't look at their prizes with the kind of careful consideration she saw in Elias Carter's pale eyes. "I won't run," she said, though the thought had crossed her mind. The shackles around her wrists and ankles would make escape difficult, but desperation could drive a person to attempt impossible things. "I know you won't," Elias replied, settling onto the far end of the bench, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "Running would only make things worse for you in a town like this." Clara studied his profile in the moonlight, the strong jaw, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie sun and wind. He couldn't be more than 30, but there was something ancient in his stillness, as if he had seen enough of the world's cruelty to last several lifetimes. "What's your name?" he asked, turning to face her fully. "Your real name, not whatever Crowther's been calling you." The question caught her off guard. In 3 weeks of captivity, No one had bothered to ask her name. She had been the girl or Mayfield's daughter or worse things that made her skin crawl. "Clara," she said softly. "Clara Elizabeth Mayfield." "Clara," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "That's a good name. Strong. Where are you from? Clara Mayfield?" "Originally? Ohio?" The words came easier now, though she couldn't understand why she was answering him. "My father moved us out here 2 years ago, said there was opportunity in the territories for a man willing to work hard." Her voice turned bitter. "He was half right anyway." Elias nodded slowly. "What kind of work did he do? Before the gambling, I mean." Clara pulled her cloak tighter, the iron shackles clanking softly with the movement. "He was a clerk back in Ohio, worked for a grain merchant, but out here." She shook her head. "Out here, he got caught up in dreams of gold and easy money. Started spending his evenings at card tables instead of with his family." "And your mother?" "Died of fever last winter." The words came out flat, drained of emotion by repetition. "After that, Papa got worse, started taking bigger risks, borrowing money he couldn't pay back." She looked down at her shackled hands. "I suppose you could say I'm the last hand he played." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that ringed the valley. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Clara look at him more carefully. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "And I'm sorry about what's happened to you. No one should be treated like property, no matter what debts their family owes." The unexpected kindness in his voice made Clara's throat tighten. She had prepared herself for many things when this stranger claimed his winnings, but genuine sympathy hadn't been among them. "It doesn't matter now," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What's done is done. She took a shaky breath. "I just want to know what you intend to do with me. Are you going to... will you?" She couldn't finish the question, but the fear in her eyes completed it. Elias reached into his coat pocket, and Clara instinctively flinched backward. But instead of producing a weapon or rope, he pulled out the key to her shackles, the one Crowther had placed in the poker pot as surety. "I intend to set you free," he said simply. Clara stared at the brass key glinting in the moonlight, certain she had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I'm going to unlock those shackles and let you go." Elias held the key toward her, but she made no move to take it. "You're not property. Clara Mayfield. You're a human being with the right to choose your own path." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent weeks preparing herself for the worst, steeling her mind against violations she prayed she could survive. The possibility of freedom, real freedom, was so unexpected that her mind struggled to process it. You're lying?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Men don't win women in poker games just to set them free. There has to be a catch. You want something." Elias studied her face, seeing the fear and disbelief warring in her green eyes. "The only thing I want is to see those chains off your wrists and ankles. You've been through enough." He moved closer, his movements slow and careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. When he reached for her shackled wrists, Clara jerked away with a cry of panic. "No, you can't!" The words tore from her throat in a voice pitched high with terror. "Please, I'll do whatever you want, but don't take them off. They'll kill me if I'm not wearing them." Elias froze, his hands suspended in midair. "Clara, what are you talking about?" "The Red Vultures." The name escaped her lips in a whisper that carried the weight of nightmares. "Crowther works for them. If they think I've escaped, if they think someone helped me..." She shook her head frantically. "You don't understand. This isn't just about my father's gambling debts. The red vultures don't let their property go. Ever. A cold stillness settled over Elias's features, and Clara saw something dangerous flicker in his pale eyes. "Tell me about the red vultures," he said quietly. Clara's hands trembled as she pulled her cloak around herself. "They're not just outlaws. They're traders. They buy and sell people like cattle, moving them along routes that stretch from Kansas to California. Women, mostly, but also children, anyone who can't fight back." The pieces began falling into place in Elias's mind, creating a picture that made his jaw clench with suppressed rage. "Your father's debts. They weren't to Crowther, were they?" "Crowther is just the local agent," Clara confirmed. "The real debt was to them. $500 might as well be $5,000 for all the chance Papa had of paying it. They knew that when they made the loan. They were counting on it." Elias's hand moved unconsciously to the grip of his Colt. "How many others are there? Here in town, I mean, I don't know for certain. Maybe a dozen? They keep some of us here in town as advertisements, to show what happens to families who don't pay their debts on time." Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The others get shipped out west to mining camps and cattle towns where no one asks questions about where the women came from." The full scope of what he had stumbled into was becoming clear to Elias. This wasn't just about one young woman caught in her father's gambling debts. This was about a network of human misery that stretched across the frontier, preying on the desperate and vulnerable. "Clara," he said carefully, "I'm still going to remove those shackles, but I understand now why you're afraid. We'll need to be smart about this." "You don't understand." Clara's voice rose again, attracting attention from a group of cowboys leaving the saloon across the street. She forced herself to speak more quietly. "If they even suspect I'm free, they'll hunt me down, and they'll kill anyone who helped me. You won the right to use me, but you didn't win the right to free me. That's not how their system works." Elias considered this, his mind already working through possibilities and plans. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't suspect anything," he said finally. "At least not until we're ready for them." "Ready for them?" Clara stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Mister, these aren't ordinary outlaws. The Red Vultures have been operating in this territory for years. They have connections with corrupt lawmen, judges, even some of the territorial officials. People who cross them don't just disappear. They die slowly and painfully as examples to others." A ghost of a smile touched Elias's lips, though there was no warmth in it. "Clara, there's something you should know about me. I didn't come to Deadwood Gulch looking for a poker game. I came looking for the Red Vultures." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" "I've been tracking them for 3 years, Elias said quietly. "Ever since they took my sister from a settlement outside Denver. By the time I found their camp, it was too late to save her. But it wasn't too late to start hunting the men responsible." The revelation hit Clara like a thunderbolt. She looked at this quiet stranger with new eyes, seeing past the calm exterior to the core of steel beneath. This wasn't a drifter who had stumbled into their world by accident. This was a predator who had been stalking his prey for years. "Your sister," she said softly. "What happened to her?" Elias's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the night wind. Her name was Sarah. She was 17, and she believed the best of everyone she met. When the Red Vultures came through our settlement, she tried to help a woman they claimed was sick. It was a trap. His hands clenched into fists. I found her body 6 months later, in a canyon 50 miles from where they took her. What they did to her." He stopped, unable to continue. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not just for this stranger's sister, but for all the women who had suffered the same fate. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So you see," Elias continued, his voice steadying, "freeing you from those shackles isn't just about doing what's right. It's about taking the first step toward destroying the animals who killed my sister and ruined countless other lives." Clara stared at the key in his hand, understanding finally dawning. "You want to use me as bait?" "Only if you're willing," Elias said quickly. "I won't force you into anything, Clara. If you want, I'll unlock those shackles right now and give you enough money to get on the next stage out of territory. You can disappear. Start over somewhere they'll never find you." The offer was tempting, more tempting than anything Clara had heard in months. But as she looked into Elias Carter's pale eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. She saw the same burning need for justice that had been eating at her own soul since her father's death. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Elias leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "The Red Vultures think you belong to me now. As far as they're concerned, I'm just another customer who won their merchandise in a card game. That gives us an opportunity to get close to their operation, to learn how it works and where their main camp is located. And then we destroy them. All of them." Clara was quiet for a long moment, weighing the dangers against the possibilities. The smart thing would be to take his offer of escape money and run as far and as fast as she could. But the smart thing hadn't saved her father, and it wouldn't save the other women currently wearing shackles in Red Vulture camps. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that you won't just abandon me when things get dangerous?" Elias met her gaze steadily. "You have my word. The word of a stranger. The word of a man who understands what it means to lose someone to these animals." Clara looked down at her shackled hands, then back at the key Elias still held. The decision felt enormous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing whether to jump or step back. Either choice would change her life forever. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help you, but I want something in return." "Name it. When this is over, when the Red Vultures are finished, I want you to help me find my father's real killer. Crowther may have given the order, but someone else tied the rope. I want to know who." Elias nodded slowly. "Done." He held out the key again. "Now, let's get those shackles off you. We have work to do." This time, Clara didn't pull away. The metallic click of the key turning in the lock echoed through the quiet night like a gunshot. Clara held her breath as Elias worked methodically to remove the shackles from her wrists, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he lifted the heavy iron away from her abraded skin. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. After 3 weeks of constant weight and restriction, her arms felt strangely light, as if they might float away from her body. When the ankle shackles came off with similar soft clicks, Clara couldn't suppress a small gasp. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had chafed them raw, feeling the freedom of movement like a blessing she had forgotten existed. But even as her body celebrated its liberation, her mind remained trapped by the magnitude of what lay ahead. "There," Elias said quietly, pocketing the shackles and key. "How does that feel?" "Terrifying," Clara answered honestly. "And wonderful, and terrifying again." She flexed her fingers, marveling at the simple ability to move without the rattle of chains. "I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be unbound." Elias studied her face in the moonlight, seeing the mixture of gratitude and fear warring in her green eyes. We should find somewhere more private to talk. These streets have too many ears, and we need to plan carefully if we're going to do this right. Clara nodded, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. There's an old livery stable at the edge of town, been abandoned since the previous owner died of consumption last spring. No one goes there anymore. People think it's cursed. Perfect, Elias said, standing and offering her his arm. Can you walk that far without the shackles? Won't people notice the difference? In this light, with the cloak, I should be fine. Most folks who see women like me learn not to look too closely anyway. It's easier on their consciences. They made their way through the darkened streets, keeping to the shadows cast by false-fronted buildings and avoiding the pools of light spilling from saloon windows. The abandoned livery stable sat at the far end of town, where the neat rows of buildings gave way to open prairie. Its weathered wooden walls leaned slightly to one side, and several boards had come loose, creating gaps that allowed the wind to whistle through with a mournful sound. Elias pushed open the warped door, which protested with a prolonged creak. Inside, the smell of old hay and leather lingered, mixing with the mustiness of disuse. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating patches of silver light on the dirt floor. A few horse stalls remained intact, their gates hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Clara settled onto a pile of old feed sacks in the corner, while Elias remained standing, his back to the wall and his hand resting casually near his gun. Old habits died hard, especially for a man who had spent 3 years hunting dangerous prey. Tell me about your sister, Clara said softly. What was she like? Elias was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tenderness that seemed at odds with his hard exterior. She was everything good about the world. He began. She saw beauty in things other people overlooked, wildflowers growing through cracks in rocks, the way morning light caught spider webs, the sound of children laughing. She used to say that God put her on earth to find the best in people, and damned if she didn't try to do exactly that. He moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Our parents died when she was 12 and I was 20. Cholera took them both within a week of each other. I could have sent her east to live with our aunt. Probably should have. But she begged me to let her stay. Said the frontier needed people like her. People who believed in something better. Clara could hear the regret in his voice. The weight of decisions that could never be undone. You blame yourself. Every day. The admission came out flat and hard. If I had been more careful, if I had seen the signs, if I had been there when they came. What happened exactly? Clara asked gently. Elias turned back to face her, his pale eyes holding depths of pain that made her chest tighten. The red vultures had been working their way through small settlements, using the same method each time. They would send in a woman, one of their own, but trained to look sick and desperate. She would stumble into town claiming her husband had been injured in an accident a few miles out, begging for help. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. And your sister responded. Of course she did. Sarah couldn't ignore suffering, real or feigned. She gathered medical supplies and insisted on riding out with the woman to help. His hands clenched into fists. I was 3 miles away, helping a neighbor repair his barn roof. By the time I got back to town and learned what had happened, they had a 6-hour head start. You went after them. Immediately. But they knew the territory better than I did, and they had planned their escape route carefully. I tracked them for 2 weeks before I lost the trail in a river canyon. It was another 4 months before I picked up their tracks again. And by then, he couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. She had seen enough of the Red Vulture's handiwork to know what they did to the women they captured. Sarah Carter had been young, beautiful, and idealistic, exactly the kind of victim the Red Vultures preferred. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary person." She was, and she deserved better than what those animals did to her. Elias's voice hardened, taking on the edge of tempered steel. "That's why we're going to destroy them. Clara. Not just to save the women they're holding now, but to make sure no other sisters, daughters, or wives suffer the same fate." Clara studied his face, seeing the determination burning behind his controlled exterior. This wasn't just about justice for Elias Carter, it was about redemption. He couldn't save his sister, but perhaps he could save others. "How long have you been tracking them?" she asked. 3 years. I've followed their trail from Colorado to California and back again. I've learned their routes, their methods, their habits. I know how they recruit local agents like Crowther, how they move their merchandise, and how they disappear when law enforcement gets too close. If you know so much, why haven't you struck already? Elias moved away from the window, settling onto a broken crate across from Clara. Because knowing and proving are two different things. The Red Vultures have protectors, corrupt officials who take their cut of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. I could kill a few of their foot soldiers, but the organization would survive. To truly destroy them, I need evidence that will bring down their entire network. Clara felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. That's where I come in. Partly, yes, but there's something else. Something I learned just before coming to Deadwood Gulch that changes everything. Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The Red Vultures are planning something big, a massive operation that will net them dozens of women in a single stroke. If we can stop that and gather evidence in the process, we can cripple them permanently. What kind of operation? They're planning to hit a wagon train, families moving west to start new lives in California. The train is scheduled to pass through Devil's Canyon in 6 days, and it's carrying something the Red Vultures want even more than money. Nearly 30 young women and girls, all traveling with families who think they're safe under the protection of experienced guides. Clara felt her blood turn to ice water. The 30 women, they're going to attack an entire wagon train? According to my sources, they've been planning this for months. They have corrupt cavalry officers who will ensure there's no military patrol in the area that day. They have guides who will lead the wagon train directly into the ambush site. And they have buyers waiting in San Francisco who have already paid for fresh merchandise from the frontier. The scope of the planned atrocity was staggering. Clara had thought in terms of individual tragedies, women like herself caught in impossible circumstances. But this was something far worse, a calculated assault on innocent families seeking nothing more than a chance at a better life. "We have to warn them," she said urgently. "Send word to the wagon train master, or contact the territorial authorities, or—" "And tell them what?" Elias interrupted. "That a drifter with no official standing has uncovered a conspiracy involving corrupt cavalry officers and territorial officials? They'd either ignore the warning or, worse, alert the conspirators that someone is onto their plan." Clara sank back against the feed sacks, feeling the weight of helplessness settle over her like a physical burden. "So what do we do? Just let it happen?" "No," Elias said firmly. "We stop it ourselves. But to do that, we need to get close to the Red Vulture's leadership. We need to learn the exact details of their plan, when, where, how many men they're bringing, what their escape route looks like, and then we need to be in position to disrupt their operation when it happens. How do we get that kind of information? Elias met her gaze steadily. By convincing them that I'm a potential customer interested in making a very large purchase. Clara stared at him, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. You want to pretend to buy women from them. Not just any women. I want to make them think I'm interested in buying the entire lot from the wagon train attack. That I represent a group of investors from back east who are looking to establish a high-class establishment in San Francisco, and we need a large number of employees to get started. The plan was audacious and dangerous in equal measure. And you think they'll believe that? Why wouldn't they? I have enough gold to make a convincing down payment, and greed makes men gullible. If I approach them correctly, they'll see dollar signs instead of asking too many questions. Clara was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. What happens after you make contact? How do we actually stop the attack? That depends on what we learn. If their camp is small enough, we might be able to disable their operation directly. If not, we'll need to find another way. Perhaps sabotage their weapons or spook their horses. The key is being in the right place at the right time with the right information. And if something goes wrong, if they discover what we're really doing? Elias's expression was grim but determined. Then we improvise. But Clara, I need you to understand something. This isn't going to be easy or safe. These men are killers, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone they see as a threat. If you have any doubts about doing this, speak up now. Clara looked around the abandoned stable, taking in the decay and emptiness that surrounded them. 3 weeks ago, she had been a clerk's daughter with a simple life and modest dreams. Now she was contemplating infiltrating a criminal organization to prevent a massacre. The transformation seemed impossible. But then again, the frontier had a way of changing people whether they wanted to be changed or not. I'm scared, she admitted. Terrified, actually, but those women on the wagon train, they're just like I was before all this started. They don't deserve what's planned for them. No, they don't. And the women already being held by the red vultures, they deserve to be free. They do. Clara took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood at the edge of an abyss. Then let's do it. Let's stop these bastards once and for all. Elias nodded slowly, respect flickering in his pale eyes. There's one more thing you should know before we commit to this path. Clara, something about your father. The sudden change of subject caught her off guard. What about him? You said he wasn't just a gambler. What exactly did you mean by that? Clara hesitated, realizing that she was about to reveal the last secret her father had made her swear to keep. But looking at Elias Carter, this man who had dedicated 3 years of his life to hunting his sister's killers, she knew she could trust him with the truth. Papa wasn't just a clerk who got caught up in gambling, she said quietly. He was working for the federal marshals, undercover. He was investigating the red vultures. The silence that followed Clara's revelation was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Elias stared at her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the shadows, his pale eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the stable's broken roof. A federal marshal, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Your father was working for the government. Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Not officially. He volunteered after Mama died. Said he needed to do something that mattered, something that would make her death mean something more than just another frontier tragedy. Elias leaned forward, his entire demeanor shifting from controlled calm to sharp focus. "Tell me everything, Clara, from the beginning." She took a shaky breath, remembering the night her father had revealed his secret mission. "It started about 6 months ago. A federal marshal named Thomas Brennan came through town, asking questions about missing women. Papa had been, well, he'd been drinking more since Mama's death, spending time in places like the Dusty Rose. Brennan approached him because he was already known around the gambling halls. What exactly was Brennan investigating? The same thing you are, it seems. The Red Vultures Network. But the federal government had received reports from California about organized criminal activity involving the transport of women across territorial lines. They needed someone on the inside, someone who could get close to the local operation without arousing suspicion. Elias's jaw tightened. "And your father agreed." He jumped at the chance. Clara's voice carried a mixture of pride and bitterness. Said it was his opportunity to honor Mama's memory by protecting other women from suffering the same fate she did. The fever that killed her, It spread through the camp because the women were crowded together in terrible conditions while being transported west. The pieces of a horrific puzzle were falling into place in Elias's mind. "Your mother was taken by the Red Vultures?" "Not directly. But she was held by men who worked for them. Papa never told me all the details, but I gathered that she had been captured during a raid on our previous settlement back in Kansas. The Red Vultures had a network of smaller operations feeding into their main organization. Mama was being held for transport when the fever struck." Clara's hands trembled as she continued. "Papa managed to rescue her before the transport left, but the damage was done. She was already sick, and the conditions she'd been kept in had weakened her beyond recovery. She died 2 weeks after he brought her home. That's why he moved you out here," Elias realized. He was already planning to go after them. Partly, yes, but also because he wanted to start fresh. Somewhere the memories wouldn't haunt us every day. Of course, the frontier just brought different kinds of pain. Clara wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. When Marshal Brennan offered him the chance to work undercover, Papa saw it as destiny. His chance to make sure what happened to Mama never happened to anyone else. Elias was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. What was his mission exactly? What kind of evidence was he supposed to gather? Names, locations, routes, financial records, anything that could help the federal marshals build a case that would hold up in territorial courts. Papa was supposed to work his way into Crowther's confidence by losing money consistently and building up debts. The idea was that eventually, they would offer him the same deal they offered other desperate men. Work for the Red Vultures or lose everything. Did it work? Clara's expression darkened. Too well. Papa was a better actor than any of us realized. Within 3 months, Crowther trusted him enough to reveal details about the organization's structure. Papa learned about the main camp's location, the names of several key leaders, and the planned attack on the wagon train. Then what went wrong? Papa got too close to something important. 3 weeks before he died, he told me he'd discovered evidence of federal corruption, that some of the territorial officials taking bribes from the Red Vultures included a federal judge and at least 2 cavalry officers. He was planning to send that information to Marshal Brennan when they killed him, Elias finished grimly. They made it look like suicide, but Papa would never have abandoned me like that. Not willingly. Clara's voice hardened with conviction. Someone discovered what he was really doing, and they eliminated him before he could expose their network. Elias stood and began pacing the confines of the stable, his mind racing through possibilities. The evidence your father gathered. Where is it now? Hidden? Papa was paranoid about being discovered, so he created multiple hiding places for different pieces of information. He told me about one of them the night before he died, made me memorize the location and swear I'd never reveal it unless something happened to him. What kind of evidence? Documents, names, dates, financial records, maps showing transport routes. Papa said it was enough to bring down the entire operation if it reached the right people. Clara looked directly at Elias. But it would also be enough to get anyone who possessed it killed. The implications were staggering. Not only had Elias stumbled upon a chance to infiltrate the Red Vultures, but he now had access to federal evidence that could destroy them permanently. The opportunity was unprecedented and extraordinarily dangerous. Clara, he said carefully, I need you to understand what this means. If your father's evidence is as comprehensive as you say, we're not just talking about stopping one attack or rescuing a few women. We're talking about dismantling an entire criminal network that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. I know. Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. That's why I'm willing to help you. Papa died trying to gather that evidence. If we don't use it, his sacrifice means nothing. Elias resumed his pacing, working through the tactical implications. The evidence changes our approach completely. Instead of just trying to gather intelligence on the wagon train attack, we can use what your father discovered to plan a comprehensive strike against their entire operation. What do you mean? If we know the location of their main camp, their leadership structure, and their planned operations, we can coordinate multiple actions simultaneously. Hit them when they're divided and vulnerable, before they can regroup or alert their allies in the territorial government. Clara felt a chill of excitement mixed with terror. You're talking about more than just stopping the attack. You're talking about destroying them completely. Exactly. But it means the stakes are much higher for both of us. Once we make our move, there won't be any going back. The Red Vultures and their allies will know we have the evidence, and they'll stop at nothing to eliminate us. The weight of the decision settled over them like a heavy blanket. Clara looked around the abandoned stable, thinking about the life she had known just a few weeks ago. The simple routine of helping her father with his clerk's work, the quiet evenings reading by lamplight, the modest dreams of marriage and family that seemed appropriate for a frontier girl. All of that was gone now, swept away by forces beyond her control. But in its place, she had found something she hadn't expected. Purpose. The chance to honor her father's memory and her mother's suffering by striking a blow against the evil that had destroyed their family. There's something else, she said quietly. Something Papa told me about the wagon train attack. Elias stopped pacing and turned to face her. What? It's not just about the women. The Red Vultures are planning to take the children too, boys as well as girls. They have buyers in California who pay premium prices for young workers who can be trained for specific purposes. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. He had known the Red Vultures were ruthless, but the idea of them trafficking children added a new dimension to their evil. His sister Sarah would have been horrified by such cruelty, and he could almost hear her voice urging him to protect the innocent. How many children? He asked through gritted teeth. Papa's notes mentioned at least 15, ranging in age from 8 to 16. Families traveling west often bring their older children to help with the work of establishing new homesteads. Elias closed his eyes, fighting down a surge of rage that threatened to overwhelm his careful planning. When he opened them again, Clara saw something new in his pale gaze, a cold determination that went beyond personal vengeance. Then we save them all, he said simply. Every woman, every child, every innocent person caught in their web. How? With your father's evidence. We can identify exactly when and where they plan to strike. We can also use it to expose their allies in the territorial government, cutting off their escape routes and eliminating their protection. Elias moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. But first, we need to retrieve that evidence and study it carefully. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Clara nodded, her decision made. The evidence is hidden in an old mine shaft about 5 miles north of town. Papa chose it because it's been abandoned for years. Too dangerous for casual exploration, but accessible if you know the right entrance. Can you find it again? Yes. Papa made me practice the route twice, said I needed to be able to find it even in the dark. Elias turned back to her, his expression serious. Clara, once we retrieve that evidence, there's no turning back. The Red Vultures will eventually figure out that someone has it, and they'll come looking. Are you prepared for that? She thought of her father's broken body hanging in the jail cell, of the fear she had seen in the eyes of other captive women, of the children who would soon become victims if she did nothing. The answer came without hesitation. I've been preparing for it since the day they killed Papa, she said. The only question is whether we're going to let them keep winning, or whether we're going to make them pay for what they've done. Elias smiled for the first time since she had met him, a genuine expression that transformed his hard features and revealed the decent man beneath the avenging exterior. In that case, Miss Mayfield, I think we have ourselves a partnership. What's our first step? We retrieve your father's evidence and study it thoroughly. Then we use it to plan our approach to the Red Vulture's leadership. If we're going to pose as potential customers for their wagon train merchandise, we need to know enough about their operation to be convincing. Clara stood up, brushing hay and dust from her cloak. When do we go after the evidence? Tomorrow night. It's too risky to attempt it in daylight, and we need time to prepare properly. Tonight, we focus on maintaining our cover story. As far as anyone in town knows, you're still my property, won from Crowther in a poker game. The reminder of their false relationship sent a flush of embarrassment through Clara, but she forced herself to think practically. What exactly does that mean? How do we act around other people? Elias considered the question carefully. We need to strike a balance, convincing enough that Crowther and his associates believe you're under my control, but not so convincing that you're put in actual danger. Can you manage that? I think so. I've had 3 weeks to study how these arrangements typically work. Clara's voice carried a bitter edge. Unfortunately, I'm well versed in appearing submissive and frightened. The difference is that this time, it's an act, and I'll never let any real harm come to you. Clara, you have my word on that. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. After weeks of being treated as property, the simple promise of protection felt like a precious gift. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet. The hard part is just beginning. Elias moved toward the stable door, then paused. Clara, there's one more thing we need to discuss. If we're going to do this, we need to trust each other completely. No secrets, no holding back information that might be important. Can you do that? She met his gaze steadily. Can you? For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question. Then he nodded slowly. Yes. But I should warn you, some of the things I've done in pursuit of the Red Vultures haven't been entirely legal. I'm not the same man I was when my sister was alive. Good, Clara said firmly, because the man I was 3 weeks ago wouldn't have been strong enough to see this through. Sometimes terrible circumstances require us to become different people. As they prepared to leave the abandoned stable and return to the world of deception and danger waiting outside, both Clara and Elias felt the weight of the commitment they had made. They were no longer just two people thrown together by chance. They were partners in a mission that would either destroy the Red Vultures or get them both killed. But for the first time since her father's death, Clara felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Not just for her own freedom, but for justice, for the innocent people who would be saved, and for the possibility that good could triumph over evil in a world that often seemed to favor the strong over the righteous. The war against the Red Vultures was about to begin in earnest, and Clara Mayfield was ready to fight. The next evening arrived with the kind of stillness that made every sound seem amplified across the prairie. Clara sat on the edge of the hotel room's narrow bed, her hands steady as she secured the fake shackles Elias had crafted from painted tin and leather. They looked convincing enough to fool a casual observer, but more importantly, they contained hidden compartments where a small key and lockpicks were concealed. "Remember," Elias said quietly, checking his weapons for the third time. "If something goes wrong tonight, you use those picks to free yourself and head for the ravine we marked yesterday. Don't wait for me. Don't try to help. Just run." Clara nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of abandoning him if things went badly. The past 24 hours had been spent in careful preparation, studying maps of the area around the abandoned mine and rehearsing their cover story until it felt natural. Elias had also made discreet inquiries around town, learning that Crowther expected him to make contact with the organization soon to discuss his new acquisition. "The moon will be dark enough to give us cover," Clara observed, peering through the curtained window at the cloudy sky. "Papa always said the best time for secret work was when God dimmed his lantern." Elias smiled slightly at the phrase. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man, even before he became an agent." "He was. I just wish I had understood how wise until it was too late to tell him." Clara stood and adjusted her cloak, ensuring it concealed the fake shackles while still allowing for quick movement. "Are you ready?" "As ready as anyone can be for digging up evidence that could get us both killed." Elias moved to the door, listening carefully for any sounds in the hallway. "Clara, once we have your father's documents, everything changes. Are you certain you want to see this through?" The question had been haunting Clara all day. Once they retrieved the evidence, they would cross a line from which there could be no retreat. The Red Vultures would eventually discover their activities, and when they did, the retribution would be swift and merciless. 3 weeks ago, I would have run," she admitted. "I would have taken the first stage out of territory and never looked back. But that woman, the one who might have been me, died in that jail cell with Papa. The person I am now can't live with herself if she doesn't try to stop them." Elias studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the transformation that hardship and purpose had wrought. The frightened girl who had sat shackled beside a poker table was gone, replaced by a woman with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. "Then let's go collect your inheritance," he said. They left the hotel separately, with Clara exiting through the back stairs and Elias departing through the front lobby 10 minutes later. The plan was to meet at the old church on the edge of town, where Elias had hidden 2 horses earlier in the day. The 5-mile ride to the mine would take them through country that was largely uninhabited, but they couldn't afford to take chances. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Clara pulled her cloak tighter as she made her way through the shadows between buildings. Her fake shackles clinked softly with each step, a constant reminder of the role she was still playing for anyone who might be watching. Behind her, She could hear the distant sounds of the Dusty Rose Saloon, laughter, music, and the occasional raised voice of men deep in their cups. It seemed impossible that less than 48 hours ago, she had been sitting in that same establishment as a prize in a poker game. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The abandoned church sat at the end of a dirt road that had once been the main thoroughfare when Deadwood Gulch was first established. Now, with the town's growth centered around the mining district and the railroad depot, this part of the settlement had been largely forgotten. Weeds grew up through the church steps, and several windows were broken, but the building's bones remained solid. Elias was waiting in the shadows beside the church, holding the reins of two saddled horses. Both animals were dark-colored and chosen for their ability to move quietly rather than their speed. In the pale starlight, Clara could see that he had changed clothes, trading his usual shirt and vest for a dark wool coat and worn leather chaps. "Any problems?" he asked quietly as she approached. "None. The hotel was quiet, and I didn't see anyone on the streets who shouldn't have been there." Clara accepted the reins he offered her, grateful for the hours she had spent learning to ride during their preparation. "How long will it take us to reach the mine?" "About an hour if we stick to the back trails. Your father chose his hiding place well. It's isolated enough that we shouldn't encounter anyone, but not so remote that the journey becomes dangerous." They mounted up and began riding north, keeping their horses to a steady walk to minimize noise. The landscape around Deadwood Gulch was typical of the territory, rolling hills covered with scrub brush and dotted with stands of pine trees. In daylight, it could be beautiful in its stark simplicity. At night, it felt vast and full of hidden dangers. "Tell me about the mine," Elias said as they crested a low hill. "What do you know about its history?" Clara had been dreading this question, knowing that the mine's past was part of what made it such a perfect hiding place, and such a dangerous one. "It was called the Lucky Strike, though luck had very little to do with what happened there," she began. "The original owner, a man named Jeremiah Hutchins, found a decent silver vein about 3 years ago. He brought in workers from back east, promising good wages and safe conditions. I take it the reality was different? Much different. Hutchins cut corners on everything: safety equipment, proper timber supports, adequate ventilation. The workers complained, but jobs were scarce, and most of them had families to feed." Clara's voice tightened with anger. "Papa learned about it because some of the injured miners came to him for help writing letters to relatives back east." They rode in silence for several minutes. The only sounds the soft clip-clop of hooves and the distant cry of a night bird. Finally, Elias spoke again. "What happened to end the operation?" "Cave-in. Last spring, during the heavy rains, one of the main support tunnels collapsed. 12 men were trapped inside." Clara's hands tightened on her reins. "Hutchins refused to authorize a rescue operation, said it would be too expensive and too dangerous. He just sealed the mine and filed insurance claims on the lost equipment. The men died? All of them. Their families never even got their bodies for proper burial." Clara's voice carried a bitterness that went beyond her own troubles. "That's when people started saying the mine was cursed. No one goes near it anymore, which makes it perfect for hiding things you don't want found." Elias understood now why William Mayfield had chosen the location. A place associated with death and misfortune would naturally be avoided, ensuring that his hidden evidence would remain undisturbed. It was clever, but it also meant that Clara would have to face her own fears about entering a place where so many had died. "Are you comfortable going inside?" he asked gently. "Comfortable? No. Willing? Yes. Clara straightened in her saddle. Those miners deserved better than what they got, just like the women the Red Vultures have taken deserve better. If I have to face some ghosts to help bring justice, then that's what I'll do. The mine shaft appeared ahead of them as a dark scar cut into the hillside, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a bustling operation. Rusted equipment lay scattered around the entrance, and the wooden framework that had supported the main shaft leaned at a precarious angle. It looked exactly like what it was, a monument to human greed and callous disregard for life. They dismounted and secured their horses to a fallen timber, ensuring the animals would be ready for a quick departure if necessary. Elias produced a dark lantern from his saddlebags, a device that could provide light while keeping the illumination focused and controlled. The entrance Papa used isn't the main shaft, Clara explained, leading the way toward a smaller opening partially concealed by fallen rocks. He said this was an exploratory tunnel that Hutchins abandoned early in the operation. It connects to the main workings but doesn't have any of the structural problems that caused the collapse. The tunnel entrance was narrow enough that they had to duck to enter, and the air inside smelled of damp earth and decay. Elias lit the dark lantern and adjusted its shutter to provide just enough illumination to see their way forward. The tunnel stretched ahead of them into blackness, its walls supported by timber that creaked ominously in the silence. "How far back did your father hide the evidence?" Elias asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "About 200 yards. There's a natural chamber where the tunnel widens out. Papa said it was probably where Hutchins planned to establish his main ore processing area before he discovered the richer vein deeper in the mountain." They moved forward carefully, testing each step before putting their full weight down. The tunnel floor was uneven and littered with debris from the mining operation, broken tools, rotted lumber, and fragments of rock that had fallen from the ceiling. More than once, Clara had to fight down the urge to turn and run back to the surface. "There," she said finally, pointing ahead to where the tunnel opened into a larger space. "That's the chamber." The natural cavern was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that vanished into shadows above their heads. Against one wall, someone had stacked mining equipment in neat piles, creating an organized workspace that spoke to careful planning and attention to detail. "Your father was thorough," Elias observed, raising the lantern to examine the chamber more closely. "Where exactly did he hide the documents?" Clara moved to the far wall, counting stones from the entrance until she found the one her father had described. It looked identical to the others, but when she pressed against its lower edge, it shifted slightly. "Help me move this," she said. Together, they worked the stone free from its position, revealing a cavity behind it just large enough to hold a leather satchel wrapped in oiled cloth. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the package free and unwrapped it carefully. Inside were dozens of documents, handwritten notes, official correspondence, maps, and what appeared to be financial records. Even in the uncertain light of the dark lantern, it was clear that William Mayfield had been extraordinarily thorough in documenting the Red Vulture's operation. "My God," Elias breathed, examining a detailed map that showed routes stretching from Kansas to California. "Your father didn't just gather evidence, he created a complete intelligence file on their entire network." Clara picked up a sheet of paper covered with her father's careful handwriting. The top of the page was labeled Leadership Structure, and below it were names, descriptions, and locations that painted a comprehensive picture of the Red Vulture's organization. "Jeremiah Kane," she read aloud. "Primary leader, based at Canyon Stronghold approximately 40 miles northwest of Deadwood Gulch. Responsible for strategic planning and coordination with territorial contacts. That's their main camp, Elias said urgently. If we can locate it precisely, we can plan our approach. Clara continued reading. Marcus Webb, financial coordinator. Benjamin Cross, transportation specialist. Samuel Tucker, recruitment and enforcement. She looked up at Elias. Papa documented everything, their roles, their habits, even their personal weaknesses. Elias was studying another document, this one bearing an official territorial seal. Clara, look at this. It's correspondence between someone named Judge Harrison Caldwell and a federal cavalry officer named Major Daniel Morrison. They're discussing payment schedules for protection services related to commercial transport operations. The implications were staggering. The corruption went deeper than either of them had imagined, involving not just local officials but federal judges and military officers. With evidence like this, they could bring down not just the Red Vultures but the entire network of officials who protected them. There's more, Clara said, pulling out a detailed schedule. Papa documented their planned operations for the next 6 months, including... She stopped, her face going pale. Including the wagon train attack. It's all here. The route, the timing, the number of men involved, even the buyers who have already paid for the captives. Elias leaned over her shoulder to read the document. According to William Mayfield's intelligence, the Red Vultures plan to attack the wagon train in Devil's Canyon using a force of 30 men, all armed with military weapons provided by their contacts in the territorial cavalry. The captives would be transported to a temporary holding facility before being moved to San Francisco for final distribution to buyers. This changes everything, Elias said grimly. With this information, we can plan a counter-operation that will save the wagon train and destroy the Red Vultures simultaneously. Clara was reading another document, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Elias, there's something else. Something about why Papa was killed. She handed him a sheet of paper dated just 2 days before William Mayfield's death. It was a letter addressed to Marshal Thomas Brennan, detailing a discovery that had apparently prompted the urgent communication. He found out about a federal investigation, Clara said quietly. Someone in Washington had been feeding information to the Red Vultures about planned law enforcement operations. Papa identified the source. Elias read the letter twice, feeling pieces of a larger conspiracy falling into place. Judge Caldwell wasn't just taking bribes for protection. He was actively sabotaging federal investigations, ensuring that any attempts to shut down the Red Vultures would fail. That's why they killed Papa so quickly, Clara realized. He had discovered something that threatened the entire conspiracy, not just the local operation. As they continued examining the documents, the full scope of William Mayfield's investigation became clear. He had spent months infiltrating the Red Vultures network, documenting not just their criminal activities but their connections to corrupt officials throughout the territory. The evidence in the satchel was enough to bring down dozens of people and destroy an organization that had operated with impunity for years. But it was also enough to get them both killed if the wrong people discovered they had it. We need to get this information somewhere safe, Elias said, carefully rewrapping the documents. And then we need to plan our next move very carefully. Once we start using this evidence, we'll have made enemies of some very powerful people. Clara nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Her father had died protecting this information, and now it was their responsibility to ensure his sacrifice had meaning. As they prepared to leave the abandoned mine, both Clara and Elias felt the weight of destiny settling over them. They were no longer just trying to stop a single attack or rescue a few captives. They were about to wage war against an entire network of corruption and cruelty that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The battle for justice was about to begin, and they were armed with the most dangerous weapon of all, the truth. The Red Vulture's stronghold emerged from the canyon walls like something carved by the devil himself. After 2 days of careful travel following the routes detailed in William Mayfield's documents, Clara and Elias had finally reached the heart of the criminal organization that had destroyed so many lives. The camp was larger and more sophisticated than either of them had expected. Wooden buildings with sod roofs were arranged in a rough semicircle against the canyon's back wall, protected by natural stone barriers on 3 sides and a series of defensive positions at the canyon's mouth. Armed sentries patrolled designated routes, and Clara counted at least 20 men visible from their concealed position among the rocks above. "They've built themselves a fortress," Elias murmured, studying the layout through a small spyglass. "Getting in won't be as simple as I hoped." Clara adjusted her position on the rocky ledge, the fake shackles clicking softly with the movement. They had decided to approach the Red Vultures as planned customers, with Elias posing as a wealthy investor and Clara playing the role of his recently acquired property. The ruse would hopefully get them close enough to gather intelligence about the wagon train attack while positioning them to strike when the moment was right. "Look there." Clara pointed toward a large corral near the center of the camp. "Those aren't horses." Elias focused the spyglass on the area she indicated, and his jaw tightened with controlled rage. The corral held dozens of women and children, all wearing the distinctive iron shackles that marked them as Red Vulture captives. Even from this distance, he could see their poor condition, torn clothing, haunted expressions, and the defeated posture of people who had given up hope. "We're going to save all of them," Clara said quietly, reading the determination in his face. "Every single one. That's the plan. But first, we need to get close enough to learn the details of their security arrangements and confirm the timing of the wagon train attack." Elias collapsed the spyglass and secured it in his coat. "Are you ready to face whatever we find down there?" Clara thought of her father's documents, now safely hidden in a new location, and of the innocent families currently traveling toward this trap. "I've been ready since the night they killed Papa." They made their way down from the rocky overlook, following a narrow trail that wound between massive boulders toward the canyon floor. The approach had been carefully chosen based on information in William Mayfield's notes. It was the route used by legitimate visitors to the camp, designed to funnel potential threats into a controlled path where they could be easily observed and eliminated if necessary. As they reached the outer perimeter, a voice called out from behind a collection of rocks. "That's far enough, strangers. State your business." Elias raised his hands slightly, keeping them visible but ready to reach for his weapons if needed. "Name's Carter. I sent word through Crowther in Deadwood Gulch about conducting some business with your organization." A man emerged from concealment, rifle trained on them with professional steadiness. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of careful movements that spoke of military training. 2 more guards appeared from different positions, creating a crossfire that would be difficult to escape. "Crowther mentioned you might be coming," the lead guard said, his eyes moving between Elias and Clara with calculating precision. "Said you had some interesting proposals about merchandise acquisition." "That's right. My associates back east are looking to establish operations in California, and we need a reliable supply of quality workers." Elias's voice carried the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to buying whatever he wanted. "Crowther suggested your organization might be able to accommodate our needs." The guard studied them for another long moment, then gestured toward the camp with his rifle barrel. "Boss will want to talk to you personally. But first, you surrender your weapons. All of them." Elias had expected this demand and had prepared accordingly. He slowly removed his Colt 45 and a backup Derringer, handing them over while keeping his most important weapons concealed. A knife remained strapped to his thigh beneath his chaps, and Clara carried lockpicks and a small blade hidden in her fake shackles. "The woman stays shackled," the guard continued, examining Elias's weapons with professional interest. "Boss's orders, no exceptions." "Understood," Elias replied. "She's well trained. Won't cause any trouble." Clara forced herself to adopt the submissive posture she had perfected during her weeks of actual captivity, keeping her eyes downcast and her movements restricted. The performance was made easier by the very real fear coursing through her veins. One mistake now could get them both killed and doom the wagon train to its planned fate. They were escorted through the camp, passing close enough to the holding area to see the captives more clearly. Clara's heart broke at the sight of so many women and children in such desperate circumstances. Some appeared to be recent captures, still showing signs of fight and hope. Others had the hollow-eyed look of people who had been broken by weeks or months of captivity. The main building was larger than the others, constructed with obvious attention to both comfort and security. Guards flanked the entrance, and Clara noticed that the windows were positioned to provide clear fields of fire across the entire camp. Whoever led the Red Vultures was both intelligent and paranoid. A dangerous combination. Inside, the building was surprisingly well appointed, with quality furniture and decorations that spoke of considerable wealth. Maps covered one wall, showing routes across the Western territories marked with dates and numbers that Clara suspected represented human cargo. A large desk dominated the center of the room, behind which sat a man who could only be Jeremiah Kane. Kane was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of refined appearance that would have allowed him to blend into polite society anywhere in the country. His clothes were expensive but practical, and his pale gray eyes held an intelligence that made him far more dangerous than any common outlaw. "Mr. Carter," Kane said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence. Crowther's message was quite intriguing. "Please, have a seat. We have much to discuss." 2 chairs had been positioned in front of the desk, clearly arranged to put visitors at a psychological disadvantage. Elias settled into one while Clara remained standing behind him, playing her role as property rather than participant. "I understand you're interested in making a substantial purchase," Kane continued, his eyes moving between them with calculating interest. "Crowther mentioned something about establishing operations in California." "That's correct," Elias replied, settling into his role as wealthy customer. "My associates represent a consortium of investors looking to establish high-class establishments in San Francisco and Sacramento. We need a significant number of women to staff these operations, and we're willing to pay premium prices for quality merchandise." Kane smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Quality is indeed our specialty, Mr. Carter. But I'm curious about your timeline. When would you need delivery of such a large order?" "Within the next month, if possible. We have significant investments in building leases and equipment, and delays cost money." Elias leaned forward slightly, projecting the impatience of a businessman accustomed to having his demands met immediately. "Interesting timing," Kane mused. "It happens that we have a major acquisition scheduled for later this week that should provide exactly the type of merchandise you're seeking. Young, healthy women from good families, plus some children who can be trained for specialized work." Clara felt her blood turn cold at the casual way Kane discussed human beings as merchandise, but she forced herself to maintain her submissive pose. This was exactly the information they needed, confirmation of the wagon train attack and its timing. "How many are we talking about?" Elias asked. Approximately 30 women and girls plus 15 children of various ages, all captured fresh, which means they'll require some breaking in, but the quality will be exceptional. Kane moved to the wall map, pointing to a location Clara recognized from her father's documents. We're intercepting a wagon train here, in Devil's Canyon. 3 days from now. That sounds promising. What kind of price are we discussing? Kane named a figure that made Clara's eyes widen despite her assumed role. The amount represented more money than most frontier families would see in a lifetime, all for the sale of human beings who would be worked to death in California's mining camps and brothels. The price includes transportation to a secure holding facility and delivery anywhere within California. Kane continued. We also guarantee the health and compliance of all merchandise upon delivery. Elias nodded as if considering the offer seriously. I'll need to examine the merchandise before making a final commitment. Can that be arranged? Certainly. In fact, I insist upon it. We have several samples currently available for inspection. Kane gestured toward Clara. I notice you've already acquired some merchandise of your own. Local acquisition? Won her from Crowther in a poker game, Elias replied with a casual shrug. Seemed like a good way to test the quality of your organization's offerings before making a larger investment. Kane's smile widened, and Clara realized he was genuinely amused by what he saw as Elias's clever business approach. Excellent strategy. And what's your assessment so far? She's been adequate, well-trained, obedient, attractive enough for the work. If your other merchandise is of similar quality, I think we can do business. The casual discussion of her worth as property made Clara's skin crawl, but she understood the necessity of maintaining their cover. Kane was clearly testing Elias's legitimacy as a customer, and any sign of moral squeamishness would immediately expose them as frauds. Would you like to inspect our current inventory? Kane asked. I think you'll find the selection quite impressive. I'd appreciate that, Elias replied. But first, I need to understand your security arrangements for the upcoming acquisition. My investors will want assurance that the operation won't be compromised by law enforcement interference. Kane's expression grew more serious. Security is our primary concern. Mr. Carter, we have arrangements with certain territorial officials that ensure any law enforcement activities in the area will be redirected. Additionally, we maintain excellent intelligence about cavalry movements and martial activities. What about the wagon train's own security? I assume they have guards. 6 men, all inexperienced settlers who've never faced professional soldiers. We'll be deploying 30 of our best fighters, all armed with military weapons provided by our allies in the territorial cavalry. Kane's confidence was absolute. The entire operation should be completed within an hour. Clara forced herself to remain still despite the rage building inside her. Kane was discussing the planned massacre of innocent families with the same casual tone he might use to describe a business transaction. The man was a monster, and she found herself looking forward to the moment they could bring him to justice. And after the acquisition? Elias pressed. How do you handle transport to the holding facility? We have a secure compound about 20 miles south of here, specifically designed for processing large groups of new acquisitions. The merchandise will be held there for evaluation and preparation before final transport to California. Kane moved back to his desk, pulling out a detailed map of the region. The route is carefully planned to avoid any areas where we might encounter interference. Once the merchandise is secured at the processing facility, we can arrange viewing for potential customers. Elias studied the map, memorizing details that would be crucial for planning their counter-operation. How long do you typically hold merchandise at the processing facility? No more than a week. Extended holding increases the risk of discovery and reduces the merchandise's value due to deteriorating condition. Kane rolled up the map and returned it to his desk. We find that quick processing and immediate transport produces the best results for all concerned. Excellent, Elias said, projecting satisfaction with the arrangements. I believe my associates will be very pleased with your operation's efficiency. Kane studied him for a moment, and Clara sensed that they were approaching a crucial test of their deception. Before we proceed further, Mr. Carter, I need to verify your financial capacity. The investment we're discussing represents a substantial sum. Elias had anticipated this demand and come prepared. From his coat, he produced a leather pouch containing gold coins and banknotes totaling nearly $1,000. His entire savings accumulated over 3 years of hunting the red vultures, plus additional funds he had borrowed against his ranch back in Colorado. This represents our good faith deposit, he said, placing the pouch on Kane's desk. The remainder will be paid upon delivery of the merchandise to California. Kane examined the contents of the pouch with obvious satisfaction. The amount was significant enough to demonstrate serious intent while not being so large as to seem suspicious. Very good. Mr. Carter, I believe we can indeed do business together. Kane looked up with a smile that Clara found absolutely chilling. Now, shall we inspect our current inventory? I think you'll find the quality quite impressive. As they prepared to leave Kane's office for a tour of the holding facilities, Clara realized that they had successfully infiltrated the heart of the Red Vulture's operation. They now had detailed information about the planned wagon train attack, the location of the processing facility, and the organization's security arrangements. But they also had first-hand confirmation of the evil they were fighting against. The casual brutality with which Kane discussed human suffering had strengthened Clara's resolve to see this mission through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. The war against the Red Vultures was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and Clara Mayfield was ready to face whatever horrors awaited them in the holding facilities. Justice for her father and freedom for the captives were worth any risk. The night of the rescue had arrived with a blood-red sunset that painted the canyon walls in shades of violence. Clara lay on her narrow cot in the quarters Kane had assigned to merchandise awaiting transport, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the signal that would begin their desperate gambit. 2 days had passed since their tour of the holding facilities. 2 days of witnessing horrors that would haunt her dreams forever, if she lived long enough to have dreams again. The women and children held by the Red Vultures existed in conditions that stripped away human dignity one piece at a time. Clara had been forced to watch Elias evaluate captives like livestock while maintaining his cover as a potential buyer. And she had seen the cold calculation in Kane's eyes as he discussed the training methods used to break resistant merchandise. But those 2 days had also provided invaluable intelligence. Clara now knew the guard rotation schedules, the locations of weapons stores, and most importantly, the timing of the convoy that would depart tomorrow morning to attack the wagon train in Devil's Canyon. The plan Elias had outlined was audacious in its simplicity. Strike the Red Vulture's camp while their main force was away, free the captives, and create enough chaos to prevent the wagon train attack from proceeding as scheduled. With 30 of Kane's best fighters committed to the canyon operation, the stronghold would be defended by only a skeleton crew, making it vulnerable for the first time in years. A soft whistle drifted through the barred window of Clara's quarters, the signal she had been waiting for. Moving quickly but quietly, she retrieved the lockpicks hidden in her fake shackles and began working on the door's heavy padlock. Her father had taught her the basics of lock manipulation during her childhood, claiming it was a useful skill for anyone living on the frontier. She had never imagined she would use those lessons to escape from a criminal stronghold. The lock yielded with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the night silence. Clara eased the door open and slipped into the corridor, her heart pounding as she made her way toward the main holding area where the other captives were confined. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp preparing for sleep, guards calling out passwords, the distant murmur of conversation from the barracks, and the restless movement of horses in the corrals. Kane had departed that afternoon with his convoy, taking his most experienced fighters and leaving the stronghold under the command of his lieutenant, Marcus Webb. Clara reached the main holding facility and began working on the series of locks that secured the heavy wooden doors. Each lock seemed to take an eternity to open, and she found herself jumping at every sound from the darkness around her. If she were discovered now, before freeing any of the captives, the entire plan would collapse. The first door opened to reveal a dozen women crowded into a space barely large enough for half that number. Their eyes reflected a mixture of hope and terror as Clara appeared in the doorway, and she pressed a finger to her lips to indicate the need for silence. "I'm here to help," she whispered urgently. "But we need to move quickly and quietly. Can you help the others stay calm?" An older woman with steel-gray hair and determined eyes stepped forward. "My name is Martha Henderson. I was taken 3 weeks ago when they hit our settlement near Denver. What's your plan, child?" "My partner is creating a distraction on the other side of camp. We have maybe 10 minutes to get everyone free and moving toward the canyon entrance." Clara handed Martha one of her lockpicks. "Can you work on the children's quarters while I handle the other buildings?" Martha nodded grimly. "I raised 7 children of my own. I know how to keep young ones calm in a crisis." They separated, moving with desperate efficiency from building to building. Clara's hands shook as she worked each lock, knowing that discovery meant death not just for herself, but for all the captives depending on her. Behind her, she could hear Martha speaking in urgent whispers to the children, organizing them into small groups that could move quietly together. The sound of shouting erupted from the far side of camp, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Elias had begun his part of the operation, using incendiary devices made from materials scavenged around the camp to create fires in the ammunition storage and horse corrals. The distraction was working. She could hear guards running toward the commotion, their voices raised in alarm and confusion. "Now," Clara hissed to the growing group of freed captives. "Everyone toward the canyon entrance, but stay low and move in the shadows." The evacuation began like a ghostly procession through the darkness. Martha Henderson proved invaluable, keeping the children calm while helping organize the women into a protective formation that shielded the youngest and weakest members of the group. Clara counted heads as they moved, 37 people in total, ranging from girls barely old enough to work to women in their 50s. They were halfway to the canyon entrance when everything went wrong. A sentry who had been overlooked in Clara's reconnaissance suddenly appeared from behind a storage building, his rifle already trained on the group of escapees. "Stop right there," he shouted. "Everyone on the ground, now!" The captives froze in terror, and Clara felt her heart sink as she realized their desperate gambit was about to fail. But before the guard could call for reinforcements, a shadow detached itself from the rocks above and dropped silently onto the man's shoulders. Elias's attack was swift and efficient, dropping the guard unconscious before he could raise another alarm. But the brief struggle had cost them precious time, and Clara could see more guards beginning to converge on their position as they investigated the source of the shouting. "Run!" Elias commanded, appearing at Clara's side with his recovered weapons. "Get them to the rally point. I'll hold off pursuit." "Not without you." Clara grabbed his arm. refusing to abandon the man who had risked everything to help her achieve justice for her father. "Hey, this isn't a discussion." Elias pushed her toward the fleeing captives. "Those women and children need you to get them to safety. Go!" The sound of approaching boots echoed off the canyon walls as more Red Vulture guards responded to the alarm. Clara realized with sickening clarity that they had perhaps 2 minutes before being completely surrounded. The choice was agonizing: save herself and the captives, or stay and fight alongside Elias in a battle they couldn't win. "Martha," she called to the older woman. "Take them to the horses we cached at the North Rim. There's food and water in the saddlebags." "What about you?" Martha demanded, even as she began organizing the evacuation. "I'm staying with him," Clara replied, drawing the small revolver Elias had given her during their planning. "Someone needs to make sure you all get away safely." The next few minutes passed in a chaos of gunfire and desperate movement. Elias had positioned himself behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent cover while commanding the approaches to the canyon entrance. His marksmanship proved devastating in the confined space. Each shot found its target, dropping guards who tried to advance on their position. But Clara could see that their ammunition wouldn't last much longer, and the Red Vultures were beginning to coordinate their attacks instead of rushing forward individually. Marcus Webb had taken command of the defense and was organizing his men into flanking movements that would eventually overwhelm their position. "Clara," Elias called during a brief lull in the fighting. "There's something you need to know." "What?" she shouted back, reloading her revolver with shaking hands. "The wagon train. It's not just random families, according to documents I found in Kane's office. It's carrying the territorial governor's daughter and her wedding party. That's why they want it so badly." The revelation hit Clara like a thunderbolt. If the Red Vultures succeeded in capturing the governor's daughter, they would have leverage that could protect their entire operation indefinitely. No territorial official would dare move against them while they held such a valuable hostage. "We have to warn them," Clara called back. "The only way to do that is to survive this fight." Elias triggered another shot, dropping a guard who had tried to advance on their left flank. "And right now, that's looking unlikely," as if summoned by his words. Marcus Webb himself appeared at the edge of their defensive perimeter, flanked by half a dozen armed men. The Red Vulture lieutenant was younger than Kane but possessed the same cold intelligence that made him dangerous in a completely different way. "You're surrounded," Webb called out. "Surrender now and I'll make your deaths quick. Continue fighting and I'll make sure you live long enough to regret it." "A counteroffer," Elias shouted back. "Go to hell!" His response was punctuated by another precise shot that forced Webb and his men to dive for cover. But Clara could see that their situation was becoming hopeless. More guards were arriving every minute, and soon they would be completely overwhelmed by superior numbers. That was when the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, accompanied by voices shouting commands in the darkness. For a moment, Clara feared that Kane had returned early from his mission, bringing reinforcements that would seal their doom. Instead, the new arrivals proved to be Martha Henderson and several of the freed captives, returning with weapons taken from the Red Vulture's own armory. The older woman had organized a rescue mission of her own, refusing to abandon the people who had risked everything to save her and the others. "Thought you might need some help," Martha called out, taking position behind a boulder with a Winchester rifle that looked almost too big for her to handle. The tide of battle shifted dramatically as the freed captives opened fire on the Red Vulture guards from an unexpected direction. Webb's men found themselves caught in a crossfire, forced to divide their attention between multiple threats while trying to maintain their assault on Elias and Clara's position. "Now's our chance," Elias called to Clara. "We need to get to the horses and warn that wagon train." Together, they fought their way toward the canyon entrance, supported by covering fire from Martha's improvised militia. The Red Vulture guards, confused and demoralized by the unexpected resistance, began falling back toward the main camp to regroup. As they reached the cached horses, Clara turned for one last look at the stronghold that had held so many innocent people in bondage. Fires were burning throughout the camp, ammunition was exploding in random bursts, and the carefully organized criminal operation was dissolving into chaos. "Your father would be proud," Elias said quietly, helping her into the saddle. "You've struck a blow against the Red Vultures that they'll never recover from." Clara nodded, but her mind was already focused on the next challenge, somewhere ahead of them. A wagon train carrying the territorial governor's daughter was traveling toward a carefully planned ambush. Kane and 30 armed men were positioning themselves in Devil's Canyon, confident that their stronghold was secure and their plan was proceeding without a hitch. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. As the freed captives mounted their horses and prepared to ride towards safety, Clara realized that their night of rescue was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would determine whether the Red Vulture's reign of terror ended forever, was still waiting for them in Devil's Canyon. But for the first time since her father's death, Clara felt something she had almost forgotten: hope, not just for survival, but for justice, for the possibility that good could triumph over evil when people were willing to fight for what was right. The war against the Red Vultures was far from over, but tonight they had won a victory that would echo through the territory for years to come. Dawn broke over Devil's Canyon with the kind of deceptive beauty that made the frontier seem peaceful and welcoming. Golden light painted the red stone walls while morning mist drifted between the towering rock formations, creating an almost ethereal landscape that belied the violence about to unfold in its depths. Clara crouched behind a massive boulder on the canyon's eastern rim, her rifle trained on the trail below where Jeremiah Kane and his men had positioned themselves for their planned ambush. After riding through the night to reach this position, she and Elias had spent the pre-dawn hours studying the Red Vulture's deployment and finalizing their counter-strategy. Kane had chosen his ambush site with tactical brilliance. The canyon narrowed to less than 50 yards at this point, creating a natural bottleneck where the wagon train would be forced to move slowly in single file. Rock formations on both sides provided excellent cover for attackers while leaving the trail completely exposed. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a perfect trap. But these were far from normal circumstances. "Count again," Elias whispered from his position 30 yards to her left. "How many do you see?" Clara swept her gaze across the canyon floor, identifying the carefully concealed positions where Kane's fighters waited. 28 that I can spot, 2 more than we expected. Kane must have left fewer men at the stronghold than we calculated. Elias's voice carried a note of concern. "That changes our odds considerably." The plan they had developed was audacious in its simplicity. Wait for the wagon train to enter the canyon, then create their own ambush of the ambushers. The Red Vultures would find themselves caught in crossfire from above while trying to attack the wagon train below. With proper timing and accurate shooting, they could disrupt the assault long enough for the travelers to escape or organize their own defense. But 28 experienced fighters represented a formidable force, especially when Clara and Elias had only managed to recruit 6 volunteers from among the freed captives. Martha Henderson and 5 other determined souls had insisted on joining the fight, despite having no military experience and limited weapons training. "Target the leaders first," Elias continued, checking his weapons one final time. "If we can eliminate Kane and his lieutenants quickly, the others might lose their nerve and retreat." Clara nodded, though her attention was focused on a more personal concern. Somewhere among the Red Vulture positions was the man who had tortured and killed her father, possibly Kane himself, or one of his trusted associates. The thought of facing her father's murderer added another layer of complexity to emotions already stretched to their breaking point. The sound of approaching wheels and voices drifted up from the canyon's western entrance. The wagon train was arriving exactly on schedule, its members completely unaware of the deadly reception waiting for them in the narrow passage ahead. Clara counted 12 wagons in the convoy, each drawn by teams of oxen and loaded with the possessions of families seeking new lives in California. Outriders flanked the column, 6 men as Kane had predicted, armed with hunting rifles and revolvers but clearly inexperienced in warfare. At the center of the convoy, a larger wagon with painted sides and brass fittings marked the presence of the territorial governor's daughter and her wedding party. "Remember," Elias called softly to their small group of volunteers. "Wait for my signal. Don't shoot until the red vultures reveal themselves, or we'll hit innocent people." The wagon train entered the narrow section of canyon, moving at the slow, steady pace that characterized frontier travel. The lead scout appeared relaxed and confident, showing no awareness of the danger concealed in the rocks around him. Clara found herself holding her breath as the convoy approached the kill zone Kane had so carefully prepared. Kane himself was positioned behind a large boulder directly opposite Clara's location. His rifle trained on the lead wagon. Even at this distance, she could see the cold concentration on his face as he prepared to give the signal that would begin the massacre. The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. The lead wagon reached the precise center of the ambush zone, and Kane raised his hand to signal the attack. That was when Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. A small figure had wandered away from one of the central wagons. A child, perhaps 6 years old, chasing a butterfly that had landed on a wildflower growing beside the trail. The boy was directly in the line of fire, completely exposed and utterly unaware of the danger surrounding him. "A child in the open," Clara hissed urgently to Elias. "Southwest of the lead wagon." Elias spotted the boy immediately and swore under his breath. Their carefully planned timing was about to be destroyed by a moment of childhood innocence that could cost multiple lives. Kane dropped his hand, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. The red vulture's opening volley was devastating in its precision. The lead scout tumbled from his horse, and several of the wagon drivers cried out as bullets found their marks. The oxen bellowed in terror and began trying to bolt, creating chaos as wagons collided and overturned in the narrow space. But Clara was focused entirely on the child, who had frozen in terror at the center of the violence. Without conscious thought, she abandoned her concealed position and began scrambling down the rocky slope toward the canyon floor, her rifle forgotten in her desperate need to reach the boy before Kane's men could reload. "Clara, no!" Elias shouted, but she was already committed to her descent. Bullets whined off the rocks around her as red vulture fighters spotted her movement and tried to bring her down. Clara felt stone chips sting her face as she half fell, half slid down the steep canyon wall, driven by a maternal instinct that overrode every consideration of personal safety. She reached the canyon floor just as the boy's paralysis broke and he began running toward her, tears streaming down his face as he called for his mother. Clara scooped him up without breaking stride and dove behind an overturned wagon just as a concentrated volley of gunfire swept the area where they had been standing. "Stay down," she commanded the child, whose name she learned was Tommy when his grateful mother crawled over from another position of cover. "Keep your head low no matter what happens." Above them, Elias had initiated the counter-ambush, his rifle cracking with mechanical precision as he began eliminating red vulture positions one by one. Martha Henderson and the other volunteers joined the attack, their shots less accurate but enthusiastic enough to force Kane's men to divide their attention between multiple threats. The tactical situation was transforming rapidly. What Kane had planned as a one-sided massacre had become a three-way battle, with the wagon train defenders rallying to fight back against their attackers while Clara's group rained fire from the canyon rim. But the Red Vultures were experienced fighters who adapted quickly to changing circumstances. Kane bellowed orders that reorganized his scattered men into defensive positions, and several of his best marksmen began targeting Elias's group with concentrated fire that made movement extremely dangerous. Clara found herself trapped behind the overturned wagon with Tommy and his mother. Unable to contribute to the battle while Kane's fighters pressed their attack on the remaining wagon train members. She could see families cowering behind inadequate cover, their defenders falling one by one to the superior firepower and tactical experience of their attackers. "Mrs. Carter," Tommy's mother gasped, recognizing Clara from her assumed identity during their infiltration of the Red Vulture camp. "What are you doing here?" "Trying to stop these animals," Clara replied grimly, checking her ammunition. "Stay with your boy. I need to help the others." She was about to make another desperate move when the sound of additional gunfire echoed from the canyon's western entrance. For a terrifying moment, Clara feared that Red Vulture reinforcements had arrived to seal their doom. Instead, the new arrivals proved to be a cavalry patrol led by a young lieutenant who had been tracking the Red Vultures for weeks. Marshal Thomas Brennan had finally received William Mayfield's evidence and had convinced the territorial governor to authorize military action against the criminal organization. The cavalry charge transformed the battle completely. Kane's men found themselves attacked from a third direction by professional soldiers whose disciplined volleys devastated their carefully prepared positions. The Red Vultures began falling back toward the canyon's eastern exit, their formation dissolving under pressure from multiple enemy forces. Kane himself appeared at the edge of Clara's vision, moving with deadly purpose toward the wagon containing the governor's daughter. Clara realized with horror that the Red Vulture leader was making a desperate attempt to secure his primary objective, capturing the one hostage whose value might still allow him to escape with his operation intact. "Elias," she shouted, pointing toward Kane's movement. "He's going for the governor's daughter." But Elias was pinned down by heavy fire from Red Vulture sharpshooters and couldn't respond. The cavalry was still fighting its way through the western end of the canyon, and the wagon train's defenders were too scattered to mount coordinated resistance. Clara looked at Tommy and his mother, then at the governor's daughter's wagon where Kane was approaching with obvious hostile intent. The choice was agonizing but clear. If Kane succeeded in taking his primary hostage, everything they had fought for would be lost. "Stay here," she told Tommy's mother. "No matter what happens, keep that boy safe." Before anyone could stop her, Clara sprinted from her cover toward Kane's position, her small revolver clutched in her hand. The Red Vulture leader saw her coming and turned to face this unexpected threat, his own weapon rising to meet hers. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds but felt like hours. Kane was faster and more experienced, but Clara was driven by rage over her father's death and determination to protect the innocent. Their shots echoed simultaneously through the canyon, creating a moment of perfect violence that would determine the fate of everyone present. Kane stumbled backward, Clara's bullet having found its mark in his chest. But his own shot had been accurate as well, and Clara felt a burning sensation spread through her left shoulder as she collapsed beside the governor's daughter's wagon. "Clara!" Elias's voice seemed to come from very far away as darkness crept around the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Kane falling to his knees, his hand pressed against the spreading red stain on his shirt. The man who had destroyed her family was finally facing justice, even if that justice had come at a terrible personal cost. As the sounds of battle faded and the cavalry's disciplined volleys finished breaking the Red Vulture's resistance, Clara felt a strange sense of peace. Her father's death had been avenged, the innocent had been protected, and the criminal organization that had terrorized the frontier for years was finally broken. The price had been high, but justice had been served. In the end, perhaps that was enough.